There is a house in the English countryside that has stood for centuries, and on a cold November night in the year 1874, something small and unremarkable and entirely extraordinary entered the world within its walls. The house was Blenheim Palace, a great stone monument to English ambition and military glory, its corridors lined with the portraits of men who had ridden into battles, long forgotten, its rooms smelling of old wood and candlelight, and the particular stillness that very old places carry in the hours after midnight. And into one of those rooms, before anyone had quite expected him, a child was born. He arrived early, as he would spend much of his life arriving ahead of schedule, slightly inconvenient and impossible to ignore. His mother was an American woman named Jenny Jerome, dark-haired and beautiful, and possessed of a kind of restless brilliance that never quite knew where to settle. His father was Lord Adolf Churchill, a politician of erratic genius and formidable charm, a man who burned brightly in the world of Victorian England and would burn out young. The boy born between these two vivid, driven, largely distracted people would carry something of both of them always: the American energy and the English stubbornness, the mother's warmth and the father's terrifying will. Though for most of his early years, what he would carry most palpably was simply their absence. They named him Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill, and for a long while, that name meant very little to anyone at all. England in those years was a country of extraordinary confidence. The empire stretched across more of the world's surface than any empire before it, and in the drawing rooms and parliament chambers of London, men spoke of progress and civilization and the natural order of things with a certainty that the coming century would quietly dismantle. It was a world of gas lamps and horse-drawn carriages, of rigid social hierarchies and long summer afternoons, of a queen who had sat on her throne for decades and who seemed as permanent as the oak trees of the English countryside. Into this world, Winston arrived, small, pink-faced, already, they said, rather loud. His earliest years were not unhappy ones exactly, but they were lonely ones. His parents moved through London society with the swift purposefulness of people who have many places to be, and Winston was largely left in the care of a woman named Mrs. Everest, a large and gentle nanny who became, in many ways, the first person to truly see him. She called him Winnie, she read to him, she kept him warm and scolded him softly when he deserved it, and in the particular grammar of a young child's heart, she was home. He would remember her all his life with a tenderness that never quite dimmed. There were things, even then, that he could not entirely explain about himself. He noticed beauty in odd places, in the color of a winter sky, in the particular way light moved through the tall windows of Blenheim on a grey afternoon, in the cadence of words read aloud from a book. He had a memory that clung to language, that turned phrases over and over the way a river turns smooth stones, and though no one yet knew what this would mean, it was already working quietly in him, the way deep things always work, slowly, invisibly, and without announcement. He was not, by most conventional measures, an easy child. He was stubborn in the way that some children are stubborn when they feel the world is not quite listening to them. He pushed back against authority not out of rebellion exactly, but out of a deeply held sense that the rules, as presented, were not always quite right, and that someone ought to say so. This did not endear him to his teachers. It would, in time, endear him to history. But that time was still very far away. For now, there was simply a boy in a large house, listening to the sound of rain against old stone walls, waiting for his mother to come home. She came sometimes. And when she did, she was magnificent, perfumed and laughing, the center of whatever room she entered, and Winston would watch her with wide eyes and the particular longing of a child who loves someone they cannot quite hold on to. He wrote her letters, many letters. More letters than she answered. And in the space between the writing and the waiting, something was already being shaped in him, a capacity for solitude, a habit of reaching toward people through words when the distance between them was too great for anything else. His father, Lord Randolph, was a more complicated presence. He was a man of enormous political gifts and enormous personal demons, a figure who rose swiftly in the Conservative Party and fell just as swiftly, whose moods could shift like English weather, and who regarded his eldest son with what seemed, most of the time, like a distracted indifference. Winston worshipped him. He collected his father's speeches. He read his father's newspaper clippings. He studied the man from a respectful distance, the way one studies something bright that cannot quite be looked at directly. And Lord Randolph, for the most part, looked elsewhere. This was perhaps the first great wound of Winston Churchill's life. Not a dramatic wound, not a sudden one, but the slow and quiet kind, the kind that comes from wanting something very much and understanding, gradually, and without anyone saying it plainly, that it is not going to come. He wanted his father's approval. He wanted his father's attention. He wanted, in the simplest and most human way, to be seen by the man he admired most in the world, and that seeing never fully arrived. He would carry this with him always, like a stone in a coat pocket, heavy and smooth, and never quite forgotten. And yet, and this is something worth noticing about the man who Winston would become, he did not collapse under this. He did not harden entirely. He bent, as young things bend, and he found other places to put his energy, other ways to grow toward the light. The wound was real, but so was the reaching. Outside the windows of his childhood, England moved on in its unhurried Victorian way, confident and enormous and entirely unaware that a boy named Winston was sitting somewhere within it, watching, listening, already, though he had no name for it yet, beginning to prepare. The night deepens. And the old house holds its silence, and the boy drifts towards sleep beneath heavy blankets, dreaming perhaps of soldiers, perhaps of words, perhaps of nothing at all. Only the warmth of being small and alive in a world that is for now very large and very still. There is a particular quality to English boarding schools of the Victorian era that is difficult to describe to those who have never encountered it. A combination of cold stone floors and cold morning air, and a coldness of expectation that settles into the bones of young boys and stays there for the rest of their lives, shaping them in ways both useful and unkind. Winston Churchill encountered this quality fully and without preparation when, at the age of 7, he was sent away to school for the first time. The school was called St. George's in Ascot, and it was by most accounts a harsh place. The headmaster believed firmly in discipline administered through physical punishment, and Winston, who was constitutionally incapable of simply doing as he was told without first understanding why, found himself on the receiving end of this philosophy with some regularity. He was not a willing student, at least not of the subjects placed before him. Latin and mathematics and the rigid protocols of Victorian academic life held very little interest for a mind that wanted to move in larger spaces. He did badly, he was punished, he did badly again. What he did not do was break. There is a stubbornness in certain people that is not mere obstinacy, but something closer to a deep, organic insistence on remaining oneself, and Winston had this quality in abundance. He could be bent, he could be made unhappy, but he could not be made into something other than what he was, and what he was, even then, even small and far from home and frequently in trouble, was a person of peculiar and unmistakable intensity. He was moved eventually to a gentler school in Brighton, run by two sisters who understood that different minds require different approaches, and here something began to ease in him. He found that he could learn when learning did not feel like a series of blows. He discovered history, and history discovered him, a mutual recognition, like two people meeting at a party and realizing, with quiet surprise, that they have been looking for each other. He read about battles and empires, about the men who had shaped the world through will and courage, and the ability to speak in a way that made other men want to follow. He read, and something in him leaned forward. He wrote letters home still, to his mother, to Mrs. Everest, to his father on the occasions when writing to his father felt possible. And in these letters, even then, even at 10 or 11 years old, there is a quality of language that is hard to miss. The sentences are not merely functional, they reach, they linger, they carry more than the information they contain. It is as though the boy already knew, in some wordless way, that language was going to be his great instrument, the thing through which he would eventually make his largest music. At 13, he was sent to Harrow. Harrow was one of the great English public schools, a place of ancient tradition perched on a hill above London, where the sons of the aristocracy and the ambitious middle classes were shaped into the men who were expected to run the empire. Winston arrived there somewhat underprepared and placed, accordingly, in the lower forms. He would spend his time at Harrow not covering himself in academic distinction, but doing something perhaps more valuable, finding, slowly, and with considerable difficulty, the particular shape of his own mind. He was poor at the subjects that required pure memorization and mechanical application. He was extraordinary at English. His teacher there, a man named Mr. Somerville, ran him through the structures of English sentences with a thoroughness that most students of higher academic standing never received, and Winston absorbed it all deeply and permanently. He later said that while other boys moved on to Latin and Greek, he stayed behind and learned English, and that this was not a consolation but a gift, though it took him many years to understand it as such. He also discovered, at Harrow, that he had a memory for poetry. He could hold long passages in his mind with remarkable fidelity, could feel the rhythm of a line as a physical thing, could sense when a sentence had found its right weight and shape, and when it had not. He won a prize for reciting 1,200 lines of Macaulay without error. He stood before an audience and let the words move through him, and the audience listened, and perhaps something in that moment lodged itself in him. The knowledge that words, spoken aloud with conviction and care, could hold a room absolutely still. The years at Harrow were not easy years, and they were not happy years in any uncomplicated sense. He was still largely without his parents. He still wrote letters that were answered infrequently and with a brevity that must have felt, to a boy who put so much of himself into his own correspondence, like a small recurring loss. He was not popular in the ordinary way. He was too much himself for that, too loud when others were quiet, too certain when others were cautious, too unwilling to perform the ordinary social rituals of adolescence with the required degree of self-effacement. But he had friends. And he had increasingly a sense of himself, not a complete sense, not yet, but the beginning of one, the way a photograph begins to emerge in a darkroom, shapes appearing first as shadows, then slowly as something recognizable. And somewhere below Harrow's Hill, London spread itself in its grey and golden sprawl. And beyond London, the world, enormous and waiting, and full of the kinds of stories that a boy who loved history could not help but want to be part of. The question was only how to get there. The question was only what kind of man he was going to have to become before the world would take him seriously. And that question would take many more years and many more forms of difficulty before it began to find its answer. For now there was the school and the hill and the English sky above it, and a boy standing somewhere in all of that, looking out at something only he could see. The decision was made, as many decisions about young men of that era and class were made, largely without the young man's full participation. Winston Churchill would go into the army. It was given his record of academic performance the most obvious path, not a reflection of his capabilities. Perhaps but a reflection of the way the world categorized people by their examination scores, and Winston's examination scores were, to put it gently, not the scores of a future lawyer or clergyman or diplomat. The army would take him. The army would, it was hoped, provide structure for his restless, difficult, combustible energy. He sat the entrance examination for the Royal Military College at Sandhurst 3 times before passing. 3 times. He studied and failed, and studied again, and failed again, and studied once more with a grim persistence that is worth pausing over, because it tells us something about him that cannot be found in the eventual success. The failure was real. The humiliation was real. And he kept going anyway, not with the easy confidence of a person who expects to succeed, but with the harder, quieter determination of someone who knows the cost and pays it regardless. He passed on the 3rd attempt in the summer of 1893, and was accepted into the cavalry, not the infantry he had first aimed for, as his scores were not quite high enough, but the cavalry, which was in certain ways more expensive and more glamorous, and which suited, perhaps, the particular quality of dash that already characterized his approach to most things. At Sandhurst, something changed, or perhaps it would be more accurate to say something already present in him was given, for the first time, a proper channel. He discovered that he was genuinely good at the military arts, not in a mechanical, obedient way, but in the way of someone who understood instinctively the relationship between tactics and terrain, between the movement of men and the movement of ideas. He studied military history with the same passionate absorption he had once given to the histories of empires. And now those two things, the abstract sweep of historical events and the concrete mechanics of how battles were actually won and lost, began to come together in his mind in a way that felt finally like understanding. He was 19 years old. He was, by most external measures, an unremarkable young cavalry officer in training. He had no particular prospects beyond the ordinary career of a junior officer in the British Army, and yet reading his letters from this period, one encounters something that the circumstances do not quite account for, a sense of direction, of gathering purpose of a person who has not yet found his great work, but who has begun quietly and without fanfare to prepare himself for it. It was also during these years that his father died. Lord Adolf Churchill had been declining for some time, destroyed by a disease that moved slowly but without mercy through the brilliant, erratic architecture of his mind. Winston had watched this from a careful, painful distance, had visited when visiting was possible, had seen the man who loomed so large in his private imagination diminish into something frightened and confused, and very far from the figure he had worshipped. Lord Adolf died in January of 1895 at the age of 45. He was, by the end, barely recognizable as the man he had been. Winston was 20 years old, and the father he had spent his whole life trying to reach was gone before the reaching had quite closed the distance. He did not speak of this grief in dramatic terms. He rarely spoke of it at all, in the way that people sometimes seal certain rooms in themselves because opening the door would require too much. But it shaped him. It gave him, among other things, a lifelong and acute awareness of time, a sense that the world did not wait, that the years moved fast, that whatever needed to be done now, and then now again, without delay. He decided, somewhere in the arithmetic of this grief, that he would accomplish by 40 what his father had achieved in a lifetime. He would enter Parliament. He would make his mark. He would become someone his father, had he lived, could not have overlooked. He was 20 years old, and the world was very large, and the empire was still enormous and confident, and there were in various corners of that empire the sounds of conflict, small wars, colonial skirmishes, the friction of expansion against resistance, and Winston Churchill, newly commissioned cavalry officer, began looking toward those sounds with a very particular kind of attention. He wanted to see war. He wanted, more specifically, to see himself in war, to discover what he was made of, to test himself against the thing that had made the men in the portraits at Blenheim into the figures they had become. This was not bloodlust, and it was not simple adventure-seeking, though adventure was certainly part of it. It was something more interior than that, a need to know, a need to find the self at its edges and see whether it held. The world was about to give him his answer. He went first to Cuba in the winter of 1895, traveling as a correspondent and observer during the Cuban struggle against Spain. And what he found there, the heat, the uncertainty, the way men conducted themselves in the presence of real danger, absorbed him completely. He was under fire for the first time, and he noted, with a kind of careful self-observation, that would characterize him for the rest of his life, that he was not, as best he could tell, particularly afraid. This discovery pleased him. It also settled something in him, some question he had been carrying without quite admitting it, about who and what he was beneath the ambition and the noise. He came back to England with a cigar habit and a collection of observations about warfare that he would spend years turning over in his mind, fitting them against the theories of military history he had absorbed at Sandhurst, refining them into something that looked, eventually, very much like wisdom. Then came India. He was posted to Bangalore in 1896, and India in the late 19th century was a world of extraordinary sensory richness, the heat and the color and the smell of it. The ancient complexity of its civilization pressing in from all sides against the orderly British military cantonment where he was stationed. He had, as a junior officer, a great deal of time, more time than he had ever had in his life, more than he would ever have again. He used it to read. He read with a hunger that sometimes surprised even himself, philosophy and history and economics and science, working through the enormous gaps that his irregular formal education had left in him, filling himself in the way one fills a vessel that has been long empty. He read Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, all 8 volumes, and felt it shape something in his understanding of how civilizations rise and hollow out, and eventually give way. He read Macaulay, whom he already loved, and felt the rhythm and grandeur of historical prose settle even more deeply into the structures of his own thinking. He read Plato and Aristotle and Darwin and Adam Smith, reading widely and without a fixed curriculum, guided entirely by curiosity and the particular appetite of a mind that had finally been given enough space to discover what it actually wanted. He was 22, 23, sitting in the heat of Bangalore with books spread around him, and somewhere in all that reading, something was being constructed, an architecture of thought, a set of values and frameworks that he would carry into every room and every crisis he would ever face. The reading was not merely education, it was formation. He also began, during these years, to write. Not just letters, though the letters continued, long, careful, observant letters to his mother, who had by now become more of a collaborator and confidant than she had ever been as a parent. He began writing articles. He began shaping his observations into sentences that were designed to be read by strangers to persuade and inform and move, and he found that he had a talent for this that went beyond competence, that the words came with a fluency and a force that felt sometimes as though they were moving through him rather than from him. He was becoming, slowly and deliberately and with great effort, both a soldier and a writer. He had not yet decided which of these was primary. He had not yet understood that for him they might be the same thing. The hot Indian nights settled over Bangalore, and Winston sat reading by lamplight, and the sounds of the world beyond his window, the distant music, the call of birds, the slow breath of a sleeping city, moved around him like water around a stone, and he was already in his own way something solid in the current. The northwest frontier of India, where the mountains of what is now Pakistan rise in great dry ridges toward Afghanistan, was in the autumn of 1897 a place of active conflict. The Pashtun tribes of the Malakand region had risen against British control, and the British had sent forces to suppress them, and Winston Churchill, who had been following news of the campaign from Bangalore with the focused attention of someone who has already decided what he is going to do. Arranged by a combination of persistent correspondence and personal audacity to attach himself to the campaign as both an officer and a correspondent. He rode into those mountains, and he watched and participated in the fighting there, and he was shot at, and he fired back, and he witnessed the particular ugliness and the particular strange exhilaration of men in combat, and he wrote about all of it for a London newspaper. And then in a book, his first book called The Story of the Malakand Field Force, published in 1898 when he was 23 years old. The book was well received. It was more than well received. It was read by people who mattered, discussed in clubs and drawing rooms, admired for the clarity and force of its prose, for the way it combined first-hand military observation with a broader understanding of imperial strategy, for the quality of mind it revealed. Lord Salisbury, the Prime Minister, read it and sent a message of appreciation. Winston received this message and felt, perhaps for the first time, something that felt like confirmation, not of his ego, but of his path. He was a writer, he was a soldier. And increasingly, he was something else, a figure, a presence, a name that people were beginning to notice. He was 23 years old, and he had already begun to make himself known, though known was still a very small word for what he intended. He went next to the Sudan in 1898, attaching himself to General Kitchener's campaign to retake Khartoum. Again, through a combination of persistence and the judicious use of family connections, as Kitchener had initially refused him and Winston had gone through his mother to the highest levels of the War Office to secure a place. Kitchener did not like him. Many people in authority did not particularly like him, sensing in him a quality of ambition and self-promotion that made them uncomfortable, a refusal to accept the ordinary protocols of patience and deference. Winston understood this about himself and was not particularly troubled by it. He was in a hurry. He had decided to be. The Battle of Omdurman, fought in September of 1898 on the desert plains outside Khartoum, was one of the last great cavalry charges in British military history, and Winston Churchill rode in it. He rode with the 21st Lancers in a charge against dervish forces. And it was over in minutes, and men died around him, and horses screamed, and the desert dust rose in great clouds around the galloping figures, and Winston came through it all without a wound, having fired his pistol into the chaos and survived. He wrote about this too. He wrote with an honesty that was somewhat unusual for the era, noting not only the courage and the dash of the charge, but also the cost of it, the bodies on the ground, afterward the violence done and received. The way glory and horror share the same moments in warfare without apology. He was not naive about what he had seen. He would never be naive about war. And this, in the end, would make him a better leader in wartime than men who came to it with cleaner hands and simpler expectations. He came back to England with 2 campaigns behind him, 2 books to his name, and a clear understanding of what he wanted to do next. He wanted to enter Parliament. He had always wanted to enter Parliament. It was, in the private cosmology of his ambitions, the necessary next step, the place where words and ideas and the desire to act upon the world could actually be brought together into something consequential. He stood for election in Oldham, a mill town in the north of England, in the summer of 1899. He lost. The margin was narrow, but he lost, and he received the result with the same equanimity he brought to most reverses, not without feeling, but without the kind of collapse that reverses produce in people who have not yet learned that they are not the end of the story. He would be back. He was always going to be back. And then, before he could try again, the world offered him one more adventure, one more test, one more opportunity to become further and more fully himself, this time in South Africa, where a war was beginning that would make him in ways he could not quite have foreseen famous. The war in South Africa against the Boer republics began in October of 1899, and Winston Churchill was on a ship headed there before the month was out, traveling as a correspondent for the Morning Post at a salary that was, for a journalist of his age, remarkable. He arrived in Cape Town and moved north toward the front with the eager efficiency of someone who has done this before, who knows the rhythms of a campaign, who understands where to be and when to be there in order to see what there is to see. He had been in the country for less than a month when everything changed. He was traveling on an armored train that was ambushed by Boer forces in November of 1899, and in the chaos of the attack and the derailment, Winston behaved with a coolness and a practical courage that was witnessed by a number of officers and men. He helped to organize the clearing of the track, moving around the damaged locomotive under fire, directing efforts calmly while bullets struck the metal around him. He helped some of the wounded get away. And then, when the situation became untenable, he was captured. He was taken prisoner and transported to Pretoria, to a prison camp that held British officers, and here he spent several weeks that were, by all accounts, among the most claustrophobic and frustrating of his young life. He was not a man who bore confinement well. He had never been a man who bore confinement well. The enforced passivity of imprisonment, the sense of the world moving on outside the walls while he was held in suspension, was a particular kind of torment for someone constituted as he was. He escaped. In December of 1899. He went over the wall of the prison compound at night alone, without any clear plan for what came next, and made his way through Boer territory in the dark, hiding in a coal mine for several days, with the help of a sympathetic English mine manager. Eventually boarding a freight train and traveling hidden among bales of wool to the relative safety of Portuguese East Africa. The escape was reported in the newspapers of Britain and around the world with the kind of excited coverage that adventures produce, and Winston Churchill, the name, became something different from what it had been before. He was no longer simply a young officer journalist with promising books to his name. He was a story. He was, in the compressed mythology that popular narratives create, a hero, young, daring, resourceful, uncontainable. He returned to the fighting after his escape and saw out the rest of the campaign, and came back to England in the summer of 1900 to find that the world was, in a modest but real way, waiting for him. The name meant something now. the face was known. The story had been told. He stood again for Parliament, this time successfully, and in October of 1900, at the age of 25, Winston Churchill was elected Member of Parliament for Oldham. He stood in the autumn evening outside the election count, having received the news. And it is tempting to imagine what he felt in that moment, whether it felt like arrival or like the end of one kind of preparation and the beginning of another, or whether the feeling was simpler and quieter than either of those things. The way important moments often are when they finally come, simply the sense of a door opening and the long corridor of the future stretching away beyond it, and the knowledge that it was time at last to go through. He was 25 years old. He had been to 3 wars. He had written 3 books. He had been captured and had escaped. He had stood for Parliament once and lost, and stood again and won. He had done all of this in the 5 years since his father died. With a driven purposefulness that would have looked from the outside like ambition, and which was from the inside something considerably more complicated. Part ambition, certainly, but also part grief, part longing. Part the particular urgency of someone who has looked at the brevity of a brilliant life and decided not to wait. He walked into Parliament, and Parliament was never quite the same. The House of Commons in the early years of the 20th century was a place of extraordinary verbal talent, a chamber where men competed through the medium of language, where wit and knowledge, and the ability to construct in real time, under pressure, sentences of genuine force and precision, were the primary currencies of influence. Winston Churchill had spent his adolescence and young adulthood assembling, piece by piece, exactly these capabilities. Walking into the Commons felt, perhaps, like a musician finally sitting down at the instrument he had been building in his mind for years. His maiden speech was delivered in February of 1901, and it was received with the attention and appreciation that the House gives to a member who has clearly come prepared. He spoke about the Boer War, about policy and conduct, about the nature of the conflict and what it meant for Britain's approach to its empire, and he spoke with a confidence and a fluency that belied his youth, that suggested someone who had been thinking carefully about these things for a long time. He had been thinking carefully about these things for a long time. In the years that followed, he moved with what his colleagues sometimes found an unsettling speed, crossing the floor of the House in 1904, moving from the Conservative Party to the Liberals. A shift that was seen by many as a betrayal, and that he understood as a matter of principle, a refusal to remain associated with a policy on free trade that he believed to be wrong. He made enemies. He had always made enemies, easily and without quite meaning to. He had the gift of saying precisely what he thought in language precise enough that there was no ambiguity about what he had said. And this is not, in politics, an entirely comfortable quality to possess. But he also made a reputation, and the reputation grew. He was appointed to junior government positions, and then to more senior ones, and in each position he brought the same qualities: energy, a willingness to work at a pace that exhausted those around him, an ability to hold in his mind simultaneously the large strategic picture and the small practical detail, and a prose style that turned government documents and political speeches into something that people actually wanted to read. He became president of the Board of Trade in 1908 under the Liberal Prime Minister Herbert Asquith, and then Home Secretary in 1910, and then the position that was to shape the next crucial years most profoundly, First Lord of the Admiralty in 1911. He was 36 years old, and he had been given responsibility for the greatest naval force in the world at a moment when Europe was beginning slowly and with the inexorable quality of a tide coming in, to prepare itself for a war of a scale and nature that no one had yet fully imagined. He took to the Admiralty with the concentrated enthusiasm of a man who had been given the thing he did not know he wanted until he had it. He visited ships. He sailed on them, spending weeks at sea, studying the technology and the tactics of naval warfare with the same hungry thoroughness he had once brought to his reading in Bangalore. He pushed for modernization, for the shift from coal to oil, for the development of new weapon systems, for the expansion and strengthening of the fleet. He was not always easy to work with. He was never easy to work with. But the work got done, and the fleet that Britain would send to war in 1914 was, in no small part, his creation. In these same years, he had also found something he had not expected to find, or rather, someone. Her name was Clementine Hosier, and she was 23 years old when they married in September of 1908, and she was, by most accounts, the most important relationship of Winston Churchill's life. She was intelligent in a way that did not merely complement his intelligence, but challenged it, asked questions he had not asked himself, saw things he had missed. She was more emotionally perceptive than he was, more aware of the human cost of his decisions, less willing to sacrifice the personal for the political. She was also brave, quietly, sustainedly brave in the way that people are brave who do not think of themselves as brave, but simply endure the things that need enduring. She would stand beside him through everything that came. Through the disasters and the triumphs, through the long valleys of political failure and the steep peaks of crisis and acclaim, she would remain steady, clear-eyed, loving him with what must have required, on certain occasions, a very large and very particular kind of patience. He loved her. He was not always easy to love, and he knew it, and he was grateful for her in a way he did not always express well, but which was, in the private accounting of his heart, among the things he valued most in his life. They had children. They built a life, and around that life, the world continued its slow and terrible preparation. The summer of 1914 arrived in Europe like any other summer, warm, unhurried, the ordinary pleasures of the season playing out across the continent in the way they always had. And then, in a matter of weeks, it became something else entirely. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo in late June set in motion a sequence of alliances and ultimatums and mobilizations that had a logic to them in retrospect that was entirely clear, and that at the time felt to many of those caught in it as bewildering and unstoppable as a flood. Britain declared war on Germany on the 4th of August, 1914. Winston Churchill, as First Lord of the Admiralty, was one of the few members of the government who had seen this coming and had spent years preparing for it. The fleet was ready. When the mobilization orders went out, the naval machinery moved with the smooth efficiency of something well-maintained, and carefully planned, and Churchill felt in the midst of the horror of what was beginning. Something that he would later describe with characteristic honesty as a kind of terrible exhilaration. The sense of the thing he had been preparing for finally arriving, the work about to be tested. The war began badly for everyone and did not improve for a very long time. The particular nightmare of the Western Front, the trenches, the mud, the industrial scale dying for yards of ground, was unlike anything that any of the military planners on any side had imagined or prepared for. And the early months of the conflict consumed lives at a rate that was simply incomprehensible to those attempting to process the numbers. Winston watched this from the Admiralty with the particular anguish of someone who is responsible for one portion of an enormous disaster and who can see clearly that the overall strategy is not working, but who does not have the authority to change it. He looked for alternative approaches. He looked for places where movement was still possible, where the war might be broken open instead of grinding forward inch by inch through the mud and the wire. He found, or thought he found, such a place in the Dardanelles. The plan, conceived in the early months of 1915, was to force a naval passage through the Dardanelles Strait, capture Constantinople, knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war, and open a supply route to Russia. A strategic stroke that might, if it worked, change the entire shape of the conflict. It was a bold idea. It was perhaps a brilliant idea. The execution of it was a catastrophe. The naval assault on the Dardanelles in March of 1915 failed when British ships struck mines and were sunk. And the subsequent land campaign at Gallipoli became one of the most painful episodes in the military histories of Britain, Australia, and New Zealand. Months of fighting on a hostile peninsula against well-entrenched Ottoman defenders, enormous casualties, eventual evacuation, with nothing gained. Winston had not planned Gallipoli alone. He had not even commanded it. Military command was in other hands entirely. But he had championed the strategy, had pushed for it when others were hesitant, had lent his voice and his energy and his authority to its promotion, and when it failed. The failure attached itself to his name with a thoroughness that was in certain respects unjust, but which was in the unforgiving mathematics of political responsibility entirely real. He was removed from the Admiralty in May of 1915. He was given a token cabinet position, the Chancellorship of the Duchy of Lancaster, a title that meant very little. He was, at 40 years old, the man who had lost Gallipoli, and the world did not let him forget it. He sat in cabinet meetings that autumn with diminishing relevance, watching the war proceed, without him, feeling himself sidelined from the work that he believed, with every fiber of his considerable conviction, needed doing. And the sense of exclusion and irrelevance was perhaps the deepest pain he had experienced since his father's death. He was not built for the margins. He was built for the center, for the moment of action, for the place where decisions were being made. Sitting at the edge of things was not merely uncomfortable for him. It was, in some essential way, a kind of suffocation. In November of 1915, he resigned from the cabinet entirely and requested to be given a military command in France. He wanted to go to the front. He wanted, perhaps, to be useful in the most direct way available, Or perhaps he wanted to move toward danger as a way of moving away from the particular pain of public failure. Perhaps both things were true simultaneously. He crossed to France and took command of a battalion, the 6th Royal Scots Fusiliers, and spent the early months of 1916 in the trenches commanding his men with the same intense and personal engagement he brought to everything, eating with them, visiting the positions at night, learning their names, making himself present in the way that good officers make themselves present, and earning, by most accounts, a genuine respect. He was 41 years old, standing in a trench in Flanders. And 5 years earlier, he had been one of the most powerful men in the British government, and now he was cold and muddy and temporarily irrelevant. And he endured this with a philosophical stoicism that would have been remarkable in anyone, and was perhaps the beginning of something important in him, a testing, a deepening, a slow and painful education in humility and patience. He came back from France in the spring of 1916, returned to Parliament, and began the long work of rehabilitation, speaking, writing, demonstrating by the steady accumulation of argument and evidence that he still had things to say that were worth hearing. It was slow work. The stigma of Gallipoli was not easily dissolved, but he was patient in the way that people are patient when they have no other choice, and he was consistent, and he was, always, enormously capable, and these things together began, eventually, to tell. By 1917, under the new government of David Lloyd George, he was back, appointed Minister of Munitions, a position of enormous practical importance in a war that was consuming material at an almost unimaginable rate. He threw himself into it with all the pent-up energy of the past 2 years, reorganizing production, cutting through bureaucracy, applying to the supply of weapons and ammunition the same ferocious intelligence he had applied to the Admiralty and the Board of Trade and every other position he had ever held. He was back. Not fully, not yet, but back enough to feel the weight of real work in his hands again, and the feeling was like water after a long, dry crossing. The war ended in November of 1918. Europe lay devastated. The old order was gone, the empires, the certainties, the confident Victorian world that Winston had been born into. More than 15 million people were dead. The continent had broken something in itself that would take a very long time to even begin to understand, let alone to heal. Winston was 44 years old, and he was alive, and he had survived, politically and physically, the worst crisis of the century's first 2 decades. And he stood in the aftermath of the armistice with the survivors' particular mixture of relief and grief, and the strange, displaced feeling of having prepared for something for so long and then having it end. What came next would require more patience still. More years of misjudgment and controversy and political difficulty. More failure, more time in the wilderness. And then, eventually, much later than he had imagined, much later than felt possible at times, the moment that all the preparation had been for. But that moment was still far away, and the world needed to grow darker first before the need for such a man would become undeniable. The autumn of 1918 settled over Europe with the particular silence of a place where something enormous has just stopped, and Winston stood in it, listening to the quiet and wondering, as he always wondered, what came next. The years between the wars were complex years for Winston Churchill. And they were years that history has since viewed with a kind of double vision, seeing in them both the failures and the private courage, the political marginalization, and the deeper, quieter work of watching and warning, and refusing to look away from what was gathering on the horizon. He served in government through the early 1920s in various positions, most notably as Secretary of State for the Colonies, and then as Chancellor of the Exchequer under Stanley Baldwin. As Chancellor, he made decisions, most prominently, returning Britain to the gold standard in 1925, that economic historians have since judged harshly, decisions that contributed to the unemployment and economic stagnation that made the late 20s painful years for many working people in Britain. He was not infallible. He was not always right, and the weight of these errors was real, whatever the complexities of context that surrounded them. He lost his seat in Parliament briefly. He lost money in the Wall Street crash of 1929. He lost, most profoundly, the confidence of the Conservative Party leadership, who found him increasingly difficult, increasingly independent, increasingly unwilling to perform the ordinary disciplines of party loyalty when those disciplines conflicted with what he believed to be true. By the early 1930s, he had arrived at a place that he would later call the wilderness, a period of political exclusion that lasted with remarkable consistency for most of that decade, during which he sat on the backbenches of Parliament and watched the men who held power make decisions he believed to be catastrophically wrong, and spoke about this endlessly in the House and in newspaper articles, and in the books he continued to write and was largely not listened to. He had Chartwell. Chartwell was the house in Kent that he had bought in 1922, a red brick manor set into the North Downs with views over the Weald of Kent, surrounded by gardens and woodland, and the quiet that the English countryside offers to those who are seeking it. He spent as much time there as his political life allowed, and at Chartwell he painted. He had discovered painting during the dark years after Gallipoli in 1915, and had taken to it with the passion of someone discovering a language they did not know they spoke. He painted landscapes mostly, the garden at Chartwell, the Weald, the light over southern France, when he went there on holiday, the olive trees of Marrakesh. And the painting gave him something that his other work, for all its satisfactions, could not quite provide: a form of presence, of being entirely in one moment of the eye and the hand working together without the mediation of words. He could think while he painted, or he could not think, and both states were valuable. And he came back from his easel to his writing desk with a steadiness that suggests the painting was not merely a hobby, but a necessity, a form of mental maintenance, without which the great engine of his mind might have overheated. He also built things at Chartwell. He laid bricks, taught himself bricklaying with characteristic thoroughness, joined the Bricklayers' Union, built walls and a cottage in the garden with his own hands, finding in the physical labor something that balanced the purely cerebral nature of his other work. He was not a man who sat still well. He needed to move, to make, to do, and when the great arena of public life was closed to him, he found smaller arenas and filled them with the same intensity. And all the while, he watched Germany. Adolf Hitler had come to power in January of 1933, appointed Chancellor of Germany by a government that believed fatally that he could be managed and contained. He was not managed and not contained. Within months of taking power, he had dismantled the democratic structures of the Weimar Republic, established a one-party state, and begun the systematic persecution of Jewish Germans and political opponents with a thoroughness and a brutality that was reported in the foreign press and was for anyone willing to look not ambiguous. Winston looked. He had been watching German rearmament, which violated the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, with increasing alarm since at least 1932, and he had been saying so clearly and repeatedly in Parliament and in print. He was told he was alarmist. He was told the situation was being handled. He was told that Germany had legitimate grievances, that appeasement was the rational and humane response, that the pursuit of a firm policy risked provoking the very conflict it sought to prevent. He kept saying it anyway. This is perhaps the thing about Winston Churchill in the 1930s that history remembers most clearly and most justly. Not that he was right about everything, because he was not, and not that his motives were entirely pure, because whose ever are, but that on this single enormous central question, the question of what Hitler was and what Hitler intended, and what would happen if the democratic nations of Europe continued to retreat before him. He was right when it was very difficult and very costly to be right. When the weight of respectable opinion and the desires of exhausted peoples and the logic of those who wanted peace at any price all pressed in the other direction. He said what he saw. He said it clearly, and he said it often, and he was mocked for it and dismissed for it, and told by men of great respectability and considerable intelligence that he was wrong, and he kept saying it. There is a quality of moral endurance in this that goes beyond ordinary stubbornness. It requires a particular kind of confidence, not the confidence of a man who thinks he is always right, but the confidence of a man who trusts his own observations above the consensus of the room, when the consensus of the room is averting its eyes. It requires also a willingness to be unpopular, to be alone in one's reading of events, to sit with the discomfort of dissent and not soften it for the sake of social ease. Winston had spent his life in various ways preparing for exactly this, and the years passed. And Hitler grew stronger, and the governments of Britain and France found new ways to accommodate the demands that kept expanding, and Winston sat in his seat in the House of Commons and watched and spoke, and was not heeded. And the evening light over Chartwell fell across the gardens in the particular gold of English autumn, and somewhere in the world a darkness was gathering that would very soon now require everything that one aging, complicated, extraordinary man had spent his whole life becoming. Munich. The word has a particular resonance in history, a weight it carries not because of what it was, but because of what it represented, the moment when the willingness to accommodate became the willingness to surrender, when the desire for peace became, in the hands of tired and frightened men, the instrument of a coming war. In September of 1938, the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain flew to Germany and met with Adolf Hitler, and returned to London with a piece of paper bearing Hitler's signature. and the declaration that this agreement had achieved, in Chamberlain's words, peace for our time. The crowds who greeted him at the airport cheered with the desperate relief of people who had feared war and now believed, or wanted desperately to believe, that it had been averted. Winston Churchill did not cheer. He sat in his seat in the House of Commons when the debate came, and he listened to the speeches of relief and congratulation. And he rose and said quietly and clearly, and with a precision that must have seemed in that room full of relieved men. Almost brutal in its calm, we have suffered a total and unmitigated defeat. He was right. He was almost universally condemned for saying so. His constituency party in Epping debated removing him. He received hostile letters by the hundreds. He was called a warmonger, a pessimist, a dangerous relic of an earlier and more bellicose age, a man too in love with conflict to accept the genuine achievement of peace. He endured all of this. He did not retract. He did not soften. He went back to Chartwell and continued to write and to speak and to watch. And in March of 1939, when German troops crossed the border into Czechoslovakia and occupied what remained of the country that Munich had been supposed to protect, the debate ended not with his vindication. He did not celebrate. He was not the kind of man who celebrated being right about catastrophe, but with the quiet, grim settling of a question that had been open for too long. He had been right. The men who had called him a warmonger had been wrong, and now, perhaps, someone would listen. The summer of 1939 moved toward its end with the particular quality of a held breath, and on the first day of September, German forces crossed into Poland. And on the 3rd of September, Britain declared war on Germany, and on that same day Winston Churchill was called back to the Admiralty, the same position he had held 25 years earlier. When the last Great War began and a signal went out to the fleet, Winston is back. He was 64 years old. He had been right. And the war he had been warning about for the better part of a decade had finally and terribly arrived. He sat again in the rooms of the Admiralty and felt the weight of the great naval machine settling around him. And this time there was no exhilaration, none of the terrible energy of a young man riding into his first campaign. There was only the grim and absolute determination of someone who has seen what was coming and failed to stop it, and who now has to deal with what is. The war began badly. The months of what the newspapers called the phony war, the strange suspended period of late 1939 and early 1940, when the two sides faced each other across the border, without the expected eruption of full-scale fighting, gave way in April of 1940 to a German invasion of Norway and Denmark that moved with a speed and effectiveness that the Allied response could not match. Britain attempted a counter-operation in Norway that went poorly. Men were lost. The operation was abandoned. In the House of Commons, in early May of 1940, a debate was held over the conduct of the Norwegian campaign. And it became something larger than a debate about Norway. It became a reckoning with the Chamberlain government itself, with the leadership of a man who had, in the judgment of many of his own party, shown himself unequal to the demands of the crisis. Member after member rose to criticize. Old friends turned against the government. And in the vote that followed, Chamberlain's majority, though he technically survived, was so drastically reduced that it amounted to a verdict. He could not go on. He went 2 days later, on the 10th of May, 1940, the same day that German forces launched their massive assault in the West, sweeping into France and the Low Countries with a speed and scale that would, within weeks, produce the fall of France. And on the evening of that 10th of May, 1940, Winston Churchill was summoned to Buckingham Palace and asked by King George VI to form a government. He was 65 years old. He had been in the wilderness for 10 years. He had been dismissed, mocked, underestimated, and ignored. He had watched everything he had warned about come to pass. And now, with Europe falling and his country facing the gravest peril it had known since the Napoleonic age, they had come to him. He wrote later that as he went to bed that night, he felt a profound sense of relief, not elation, not triumph, relief. He had always believed he was destined for this. He had always believed the moment would come. And now it had come, and it was terrible and real and enormous, and he was ready for it. And the relief was the relief of a man who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time, waiting for the place to finally put it down. He put nothing down. He picked everything up. He spoke to the House of Commons on the 13th of May 1943, days after becoming Prime Minister, and what he said has reverberated through the decades since with an unmistakable resonance, not because it was clever, not because it was politically sophisticated, but because it was true, and because it was said with the directness of a man who had decided once and for all that the time for comfortable evasion was past. He told them that he had nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. He told them that his policy was to wage war by sea, land, and air, with all the strength that could be given. He told them that his aim was victory, victory at all costs, however long and hard the road, because without victory there was no survival. The house listened, and something shifted in the room, a settling, a resolve, the particular quality of a collective decision being made. They had heard him, and what he had said was not reassuring in any conventional sense. He had offered them nothing soft. He had offered them the truth of the situation and the commitment to face it. This was, perhaps, his greatest gift in those terrible months, not strategy, not military genius, not even the famous oratory, but the willingness to tell the truth. He did not pretend the situation was better than it was. He did not offer false comfort. He offered the thing that people who are afraid actually need, which is not reassurance, but company, the knowledge that someone knows how bad it is and is standing in it with them and is not going anywhere. The weeks that followed were as dark as any in British history. The German advance through France was devastating and swift. The British Expeditionary Force was pushed to the coast at Dunkirk and faced annihilation or capture. The decision was taken to attempt an evacuation. And what followed? The flotilla of naval vessels and civilian boats crossing the channel, the long lines of exhausted men wading into the water, the extraordinary improvised, somehow successful removal of more than 300,000 soldiers, became a story that Britain told itself about itself for decades. A story about ordinary courage and collective endurance. Winston addressed the nation by radio in those weeks, and his voice was everywhere, in living rooms, in kitchens, in the public houses where people gathered to listen, in the cars parked at the side of the road, with the radio on. He spoke not as a politician speaks, performing confidence for an audience, but as a man speaks when he means every word, with the simplicity and the weight of absolute conviction. He told them they would fight on the beaches and on the landing grounds and in the fields and in the streets and in the hills, and they would never surrender. And it was not a metaphor, he meant it. He had looked at the possible fall of France and the possible invasion of Britain and the possible end of everything that the word England meant to him, and he had decided in whatever private chamber holds such decisions that he would not flinch from any of it. And he wanted them to know. France fell in June. Britain stood alone. The Empire stood with it, and the voices of Churchill's speeches reached across the world, to Australia and Canada and India and the Caribbean, to the populations of occupied Europe listening on forbidden radios, to the men in prison camps and the workers in munitions factories and the women watching the sky for enemy aircraft. He worked at a pace that was astonishing for a man of 65 working through the nights, producing memoranda and telegrams and speeches and strategic assessments in a continuous stream, sleeping in the afternoons when sleep was possible, eating enormous quantities of food and drinking whiskey and smoking his cigars and driving his staff to exhaustion while never quite exhausting himself. He had, it seemed, reserves of energy that the demands of the crisis could not quite reach the bottom of, as though this moment, so long prepared for, was also in some essential way sustaining him, giving back as much as it took. The Battle of Britain was fought in the skies over England. Through the summer and autumn of 1940, the young pilots of the Royal Air Force going up day after day to meet the Luftwaffe, and losing men and machines in numbers that were almost unsustainable, and holding on regardless. And Winston watched from the ground and visited the operations rooms, and understood with the clarity of a man who had studied military history all his life that what was happening overhead was one of the decisive moments of the century. He stood in the cabinet war rooms, the underground complex of reinforced rooms beneath Whitehall, where the government worked during the heaviest bombing, and he looked at the maps and the charts and the reports. And he continued to write and to speak and to hold the thing together by force of will and by the quality of his presence, and somewhere in the middle of all of this, he was also afraid. The way any honest person is afraid when the stakes are genuinely enormous, and the fear was real, and the courage was real, and both things existed simultaneously in the same man. He said of the pilots who flew in those months, never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. And it was said in the middle of the battle, not after, and the simplicity of it, the clean, unadorned arithmetic of the sentiment, was the simplicity of someone who had found the exact right words for the exact right moment, which is the hardest thing in language, and the thing that he had been practicing without quite knowing it. Since he was a boy in a schoolroom learning to love the music of English sentences. The long middle years of the war, from the autumn of 1940 to the summer of 1944, were years of grinding, unrelenting effort, years of reversal and setback, and slow, painful progress. Years in which the great coalition of forces that would eventually win the war had to be assembled and maintained by a combination of strategy and persuasion, and the particular kind of personal diplomacy that Winston Churchill practiced with a naturalness that sometimes surprised those who thought of him only as a military man. He had to keep the Americans interested. This was not yet the Americans at war that would come only in December of 1941, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor and transformed the entire geometry of the conflict, but the Americans before Pearl Harbor, whose neutrality was official and whose sympathy was real, but whose commitment was uncertain, and whose entry into the war was neither guaranteed nor, for a long while, imminent. Winston had to cultivate this through correspondence with Franklin Roosevelt, through the exercise of a charm and a frankness and a personal magnetism that even Roosevelt, accustomed as he was to the company of exceptional people, seemed to find compelling. They met for the first time in August of 1941 off the coast of Newfoundland on the warships of their respective navies, and the meeting between these two men, the aristocratic English grandson of a duke and the patrician American president, both of them large personalities, both of them accustomed to being the most important person in the room, was by most accounts a genuine meeting, a recognition of something shared, a beginning of a relationship that would prove essential to the shape of what followed. They were not alike. Roosevelt was more cautious, more politically careful, more inclined to the indirect approach, where Winston preferred the direct. Roosevelt understood American politics in a way that Winston, who had an American mother but an English soul, never quite did. But they understood each other well enough, and they trusted each other enough, and after Pearl Harbor brought America fully into the war, the alliance they embodied became one of the great partnerships of the conflict. Winston flew. He flew at 66 and 67 and 68 years old, across oceans and deserts and mountain ranges, in aircraft that were not designed for comfort and that flew at altitudes, and through weather conditions that were not trivial, to meetings in Washington and Tehran and Casablanca and Quebec and Marrakesh. He flew to Moscow to meet Stalin, a meeting that was as difficult and strange as one might imagine. Two men of utterly different character and utterly different political values, bound together by the temporary necessity of a shared enemy. He flew to Cairo. He flew to Rome after the Italian campaign. He flew and kept flying, driven by the conviction that personal presence mattered, that the alliances that were going to win this war needed to be maintained not just through signals and telegrams, but through the direct engagement of the men who led them. He was not always well. There were periods of illness, particularly in late 1943 when he contracted pneumonia in Carthage and was genuinely very ill, lying in a villa in North Africa with his daughter Sarah nearby, the illness possibly exacerbated by the sheer pace and pressure of the preceding years. He recovered. He always recovered, and recovery for him meant returning immediately to work, as though the illness was a parenthesis in the story rather than part of it. In the dark moments, and there were dark moments, many of them through those middle years, he kept going by a combination of will and routine and the private resources he had been building all his life. The paintings, the bricklaying, the books. The company of Clementine, who was always honest with him, who told him when he was wrong, who kept him, through the sustained quality of her care and her clarity, more human than the immense pressures of his position might otherwise have allowed. He also kept writing. Always writing memoranda by the hundreds, telegrams by the thousands, and through all of it, the insistence on clear language, on the sentence that means exactly what it says, on the word that earns its place. He wrote a memo to his staff during the war that has become, in its way, famous, a short and beautiful instruction on the use of language in government, urging brevity and clarity, deploring jargon and circumlocution, insisting that ideas be expressed in the plainest possible terms. It was the memo of a man who believed to his core that language was not decoration, but action, that how you said a thing shaped what the thing was. The tide turned slowly through 1942 and 1943. The Battle of El Alamein in November of 1942 was a turning point in the North African campaign, and Churchill said of it, with characteristic precision, that it was not the end, nor even the beginning of the end, but perhaps the end of the beginning. The sense of proportion in that sentence, the refusal of false comfort, the acknowledgement of how much remained, and the firm placing of the moment in the larger arc of the conflict, was the sentence of a man who had been thinking clearly about the structure of historical events for 50 years, and who could hold the whole enormous shape of a war in his mind while still seeing the particular moment he was in with complete accuracy. Italy fell in 1943. The planning for the great invasion of northern France, the operation that had been building for years, that required the coordination of the largest amphibious force ever assembled, moved toward its culmination through the winter of that year and the spring of 1944. On the 6th of June, 1944, the landings at Normandy began, and the shape of the war changed for the last time. Winston heard the news in the early morning hours of that day, and something in him, something that had been clenched and enduring for 4 years, must have felt it release slightly, like a fist beginning to open. The beginning of the end had begun. The men on those beaches were dying by the thousands in the grey dawn water, and the cost was real, and the grief was real, and it was also unmistakably the turn, the moment from which there was no return, from which the direction of the whole great catastrophe had finally been fixed. He had held on long enough. He had kept Britain in the war during the months when it stood alone. He had helped assemble the coalition that was going to win. He had spoken and continued speaking. And the words had held people together in the way that the right words spoken at the right time actually can hold people together, not by explaining the situation, but by making the situation bearable through the knowledge that they were not in it alone. He was 70 years old in 1 year's time, and the war was not yet over, and there were still many more miles of the road to travel. But on a grey June morning in 1944, standing somewhere in the knowledge of what was happening on the beaches of France, he could feel, for perhaps the first time in 4 years, that they were going to make it. Victory came in Europe on the 8th of May, 1945. The crowds filled the streets of London, and the noise of it, the cheering, the singing, the long-deferred release of an entire people's held breath, reached Churchill where he sat in the cabinet war rooms, and he went out to them. And they cheered him with a fervor that was unreserved and total, because they understood in the simple emotional arithmetic of that moment that he had been the thing that held them together, the voice and the will and the unbroken refusal to accept the unacceptable. He stood on a balcony and looked out at the crowds and felt, perhaps, what a man feels when the thing he has given everything to is finally, truly done. Not triumph, exactly. Triumph is too clean, too simple a word for what follows years of that kind of sustained effort and suffering. Something quieter, something closer to completion. The sense of a thing having run its full course and arrived at its right ending. And then, 6 weeks later, in July of 1945, he lost the election. The British people went to the polls in the general election of 1945 and voted with quiet decisiveness for the Labour Party and for a program of social reform, a national health service, a welfare state, the rebuilding of a country on foundations of greater equality and shared provision. They voted in essence for the future, for the peace rather than the war, and in doing so, they voted against the man who had led them through the war with such consummate skill, because he was in their minds, and perhaps not entirely incorrectly. A man of war rather than of peace, of the past rather than the future. Winston received the results of the election, a Labour majority of 146 seats, at Chequers, the official country residence of the Prime Minister, and he was driven afterward to Buckingham Palace to resign his commission to the King. He did this with the composure of a man who has understood, or begun to understand, that history is not personal, that the verdict of an electorate on the shape of their future is not a judgment on the man, but on the moment, and that moment's pass. It was still painful. Of course it was painful. He had given everything, and the people to whom he had given it had, very rationally and very humanly, decided that what they needed now was something different, someone different, a different kind of strength for a different kind of task. He went back to Chartwell, he painted, he wrote. He began the enormous project of his war memoirs, 6 volumes, eventually each one bearing the weight and the precision of his prose style and the breadth of his historical understanding. Each one adding to the body of work that was in its totality one of the most remarkable literary achievements of the century. He would win the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1953. And the citation would speak of his mastery of historical and biographical description and his brilliant oratory in defending exalted human values, and those words were right as far as they went. Though they could not quite capture what made the writing singular, the quality of a man who had lived the history he was writing, who brought to the past the authority of someone who had stood inside the largest events of his time, and who was after everything. Still standing, he came back to power in 1951, elected again as Prime Minister at the age of 76, and served until 1955, when ill health and age and the accumulated weight of all those decades finally made continuation impossible. He resigned in April of 1955 and went, for the last time, to Chartwell and to the painting and to the quieter life that the last decade of a long and enormous existence requires. The final years came slowly and with the particular quality of a long evening, the light changing, the pace different, the world still present, but perceived at a certain remove. He painted. He sat in the garden at Chartwell and watched the swans on the lake below the house. And the swans moved through the water with the unhurried grace of things that have always been there, and the English countryside stretched away beyond the gardens in its ancient and indifferent beauty. And Winston sat among it all with the accumulated quiet of a man who has said most of what he needed to say. He had grandchildren now. The family that he and Clementine had built was around him in the way families are around the very old, present and warm, and slightly hovering the next generations moving through the house with their own energies and concerns, carrying something of him in them whether they knew it or not. He liked to paint the children when they sat still long enough. He liked the colors of the garden in the particular way of someone who has been paying careful attention to colors for 50 years, and for whom the act of looking is still, in itself, a form of pleasure. He gave few speeches now. The great voice was quieter, and the occasions for the great speeches had passed, though they had not been forgotten, in various countries and in various languages. The words he had spoken during the darkest years of the century were being taught to schoolchildren and quoted in parliamentary debates and read by people who wanted to understand what it had been like, what it had required, to face that particular darkness with that particular steadiness. He accepted an honorary American citizenship in 1963 at the age of 88, the first person to receive this honor, and the ceremony at the White House was attended by President Kennedy, who spoke of him as the man who mobilized the English language and sent it into battle. The phrase has the quality of a very good phrase, which is to say that it contains more truth than it knows quite what to do with, and Winston, listening to it from wherever he was at the time, might have smiled at the accuracy of it, at the way it captured something he had understood about himself from very early on, that the words were the weapons always, and that the battle was always in the end. A battle for what people were willing to believe and willing to endure. He had one more stroke in August of 1964, and after this, he did not fully return to what had been his ordinary consciousness. He was 90 years old. He had been, as lives go, used fully and completely, had been turned toward the largest possible purposes and spent without reservation, and now the spending was done. He died on the 24th of January, 1965, a Sunday morning in his house in London with his family present. He died on the same date as his father had died 70 years earlier, and it is hard to know what to make of that coincidence. Whether to read anything into it or to let it simply be what it was, one of those quiet facts that history throws up sometimes without explanation or apparent purpose, as if to say that certain lives have a shape that exceeds what we can account for. The state funeral was held on the 30th of January, 1965, and it was the largest peacetime state funeral in British history. The coffin was carried on a gun carriage through the streets of London, and the crowds lined the route in silence, and the cranes on the south bank of the Thames dipped their heads as the coffin passed on the river towards St. Paul's Cathedral, a gesture arranged by dock workers who wanted to pay their own tribute, and who found this way to do it, this visual, wordless, unscripted acknowledgement of what they felt. He was buried in a country churchyard in Bladon, Oxfordshire, a few hundred yards from Blenheim Palace, where he had been born. The grave is simple, the stone is plain, the place is quiet. What remains of a life is a question that the living ask, and that the dead, presumably, have ceased to need answering. But it is worth sitting with for a moment, in the particular stillness of this late hour, before sleep comes and carries us away from the weight of it. What Winston Churchill left behind is not simply a collection of historical events, though the events are real and the outcomes of them shape the world that we move through. It is not simply the speeches, though the speeches endure, and people still listen to them and find in them something that functions in the way the best words always function, as a clarification of something already felt but not yet named. What he left behind is perhaps better described as an example, not a perfect example, not an example without shadows and failures and decisions that caused real harm, but an example of a particular quality of persistence, of the refusal to surrender to the version of events that circumstance offers when that version seems wrong, of the willingness to stand in the minority when the majority appears to have made a catastrophic error, and to keep standing there saying the same thing. Not because standing there is comfortable, but because it is true. He was wrong many times. He had blind spots that were large and consequential, about empire, about India, about the right of peoples to determine their own futures. And these things were not small errors. And they cost real people real suffering, and any honest accounting of the man has to hold this alongside the rest. He was not a simple hero. He was a complicated human being who contained, as complicated human beings do, both great gifts and great failures, both extraordinary courage and considerable limitation. But on the single question that history has most attached his name to, the question of what to do when a great evil rises and the temptation of the world is to look away, he was not wrong. He was right in the hardest possible way, at the hardest possible time, when being right cost something, and when being right made very little immediate difference to the comfort of his situation. He looked at the thing clearly and said what he saw, and he kept saying it, and eventually, not soon enough, never soon enough, the world listened. There is a particular quality of courage in that kind of persistence that is different from the courage of a battlefield, though he had that too. It is the courage of someone who trusts, in the face of everything that argues against it, that clarity is worth something, that the truth, said plainly and said often, will eventually find its audience. It is the courage of someone who has decided that the work of seeing and saying clearly is worth doing regardless of the reception it receives, because the alternative, silence in the face of what demands to be named, is not really an alternative at all. He sat through the long evenings of his last years at Chartwell in the chair by the window where the light was good for reading, and he was old, and he was tired, and he had been, in the largest possible sense, used. And the garden beyond the window was full of the light of late afternoon, and the swans were on the water, and the Weald of Kent stretched away in its green and golden distance, and whatever he thought about all of it, the whole enormous arc of it. From the cold November night at Blenheim to this quiet evening, from the letters unanswered by his parents to the speeches that had held a nation together. From the boy who wanted only to be seen to the man who had been seen by the whole world, whatever he thought about all of it, he kept it largely to himself. He had said most of what he needed to say. He had written it down. He had stood up and spoken it aloud in rooms that were waiting to hear it, and in rooms that were not, and he had let the words go out into the world, and trusted them to do what words at their best can do, which is not to change everything, but to change what can be changed, to hold what can be held, and to remind the people who hear them that they are not alone in the dark. The evening settles. The fire in the grate burns low. The old house holds its silence, as old houses do, and somewhere in the garden the last of the light is leaving the sky, and the world is quiet now, and the long story has reached its ending. Rest now. The night is soft, and the story is complete, and there is nothing left to do but let it settle in you the way all good things settle, slowly and without announcement, and deeper than you expected.